Here are my thoughts on the design elements that are currently being used in Our Country's Good, which is playing at the Lyric Theatre in Hammersmith. Our Country's Good is a combination of realism and epic theatre elements. On one hand, we have the realism, the empathy created in the audience for the plight of the convicts, the suffering, the brutality, the punishments, their gut-wrenching terror at the situation that they have found themselves in, ripped out of England for Our Country's Good and thrown to the other side of the world and deposited in Australia, where they are essentially forgotten about. So we want that realistic feeling, the empathy within the audience that does need to be evident in a production, in my opinion, of Our Country's Good. We have those realistic elements. But as well as the realism, 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗂𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪, the writer, is also creating a piece of work, or has created a piece of work, which is a teaching tool. It's there to encourage the audience to think critically about the world that we live in, about approaches to punishment, about the themes of nature versus nurture, about the civilizing and redeeming forces of theatre. She is using a historical context. She's using the landing of the First Fleet in Botany Bay in the late 1700s, and she's using that as a piece to comment on contemporary approaches to punishment, to nature versus nurture. The play was written in the late 80s during a Thatcher government, and the Thatcher government had a very conservative viewpoint towards punishment and theatre. So this play was incredibly important to encourage the audience to think about how we view punishment, how we view theatre, and 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪 is using a historical piece in order to do so. This means that the play opens itself up to so many imaginative interpretations, and they're just awash with theatrical techniques that can be explored and used. We can combine the realistic elements, but we can also use these wonderful Brechtian epic theatre tools to create a thinking piece of theatre. The set design. Let's do a quick overview of, I like my hands. Set design, quick overview. I would say that the set design in Our Country's Good at the Lyric Theatre is an epic theatre style. The elements that are being used are epic theatre elements. There is no attempt to convince the audience that what they're seeing on stage is an actual slice of real life. Instead, it is very much suggested to the audience whilst keeping the space simple, functional, and as a teaching tool. This is very epic, very Brechtian, a teaching tool for the audience. The way it began, as the audience came in, we have the iron safety curtain, which is across the front of the stage, and it has a design of a Union Jack on the front. It's very muted, it's very grey, the red hues are very light, but it is distinctly a Union Jack. This immediately feeds into the epic theatre theme of letting the audience know what is to come before the show begins. We are seeing the theme of colonialism. We're seeing the fact that this is about the landing of the First Fleet in Botany Bay. We don't have that suspense. What could it be? It's showing us with that huge Union Jack. The theme is there right in front of us from the get-go. The Iron Curtain then opened. As it opened, the set was very, very simple. It wasn't crammed with so much detail that you would lose yourself in a realistic slice of life. It was still very much at all times a theatre. We were aware that this was a theatre. The back wall was bare, so you just saw the grey brick back wall of the theatre completely exposed. This is very much in keeping with epic theatre. The audience in a Brechtian theatre need to be aware at all times that in a theatre they're watching actors and they're here to think critically. Therefore, Brecht would have visible stage management, and he would have the components of the stage, the lighting rig, he might have visible costume changes, he had his half curtain where the audience could see backstage, like scene changes. All of the mechanics of the theatre are visible. The audience can see this is a working theatre space. So the back wall of the theatre is in plain view. However, they are evoking elements of realism. On the stage, they had a raised platform which was designed to look like a red, rugged Australian rock surface. It almost echoed Ayers rock, 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪, that kind of sweeping red, slightly dark, sandy colours throughout the whole flooring of the stage. And then it raised up, which allowed the actors to perform at different levels, which was quite a nice touch. They also had wooden trees and scorched grasses just dotted around on this raised platform. So they are evoking the feeling of this huge, barren wilderness that is so alien to the convicts and to the Marines who have landed there. Next thing that I noticed was the visible lighting rig. It was so clear. The bars were in the view of the audience. There was no attempt to hide them. You could see the Fresnels, you could see the spotlights, you could see all of those components there, ready to light the actors on stage. They are there to show us that this is theatre. And one of the biggest themes of Our Country's Good is the fact that it champions theatre, the power of theatre, the power of imagination. And as Ralph Clark says, people who can't pay attention shouldn't go to the theatre. So why not show those theatrical elements? Just revel in the power of imagination on stage. So on one hand, yes, it's an epic theatre teaching tool. And on the other hand, it is really championing that theme about the power of theatre. What else did I notice with the lighting? One element that I really found very successful and effective was the way that a lighting bar would lower during a scene. So the scene where Ralph kisses his dear wife's picture, in that scene, he's sitting there, he has the picture frame, and the lighting bar lowers during the scene with this huge Fresnel light appearing behind him. It was very theatrical. So I really enjoyed this. On one hand, very much in keeping with epic theatre, we're seeing the lights. Also, I found that it really reflected the ritualistic and performative element of Ralph's interaction with his wife's picture. It wasn't internalized and small and discreet. It was actually very theatrical, and the way he performed it was out to the audience. He wasn't keeping it hidden and safe. He was declaring it very theatrically with this huge light that was just so present throughout the scene. So it wasn't there to create an intimate, quiet, peaceful atmosphere. The light, and combined with the way he performed it, I found was very theatrical. It's championing the power of theatre. But what else? There's more. The set design incorporated a combination of historical pieces, or pieces that were there designed to create the mood, the atmosphere of the late 1700s, but it was also combined with very stark, deliberate anachronisms. An anachronistic element, an element that is anachronistic, is something that doesn't belong in that time period. I'm sure you guys have all seen, there's a clip from Game of Thrones, or a still from Game of Thrones, when Daenerys is sitting in Westeros, and there's a Costa coffee cup that probably should have been removed before they shouted action. That Costa coffee cup is anachronistic. It shouldn't be there. It doesn't belong in the time zone of Westeros in Game of Thrones. However, in Our Country's Good, they have actively chosen to incorporate anachronistic elements. There were plastic decking chairs. So during the scene where the authorities discussed the merits of theatre, they had wooden decking chairs, but they also had very obvious plastic garden furniture. It really stuck out and was actually quite jarring. And this in itself is a making strange technique, the Fremdung technique, which is in keeping with epic theatre. We're placing things on the stage that are strange, that are unfamiliar, that jolt the audience out of just losing themselves in empathy and instead looking at the piece with more of a critical eye. So these anachronistic elements, and the plastic decking chair is a great example. They are there to consciously encourage social and political thinking. But what else? The anachronistic elements didn't stop there. We also had props that were anachronistic. When the authorities discussed the merits of theatre, they were drinking Fosters. And the Reverend wasn't drinking Fosters, the Reverend wouldn't imbibe. The Reverend was drinking Coke. So we have these Foster's cans and these Coke cans, and then they were left on the stage. Now, I found this really interesting because my initial response was, it's messy. Pick up your mess, guys. At first thought, and I'd be interested to know anyone who sees the show as it progresses, after the authorities discussed the merits of theatre, a Foster's can was left centre stage, and my eyes were just drawn to it throughout a couple of other scenes. It was there during Harry and Duckling Go Rowing. It was there. It was then there in the following scene, and it wasn't removed until Ralph's first rehearsal, where he sort of saw it and kind of stumbled over it a bit, and then he picked it up and moved it. And I was sitting there going, oh, guys, you know, it's the beginning of the run. Didn't clear the Foster's can. And it annoyed me. I was like, I want it gone. The stage is messy. I want it gone. But, now this is interesting, at the beginning of Act 2, when the Iron Curtain opened, the set was littered with cans and debris and plastic chairs and plastic bags. It was everywhere. And I just thought, was this a really clever way of introducing the damage of colonialism, the damage that is being felt by this beautiful barren land with all these pollutants suddenly cramming and infecting the space? So maybe that can of Foster's that was driving me insane for the right reasons, because I was sitting there the whole time going, clear it up, you're making a mess, I don't like it, you're ruining the prettiness of the stage. It got me thinking. So I actually, whether it was a happy mistake or whether that one can was there for a purpose, I thought it was very clever. I thoroughly enjoyed that. So yay to the can. Let's have a quick look at lighting. I did mention that we had the lighting bars that were lowered and you could see the Fresnels, you could see the spotlights throughout the show. I thought that was very effective. Also, in terms of the colours used with the lights, we sort of had a combination of blues, which were very good at reflecting a nighttime state. For example, when Harry dies. They also had lots of sort of reds and straw gels to create the intense heat of the Australian wilderness. So the lighting was very much used in that respect to create daytime states, nighttime states. When they had scene changes, we didn't go to blackout. We had just a soft general cover, and the audience were able to see the set changes, which were done by the actors. Again, we're championing theatre. We're not trying to convince the audience that this is a slice of life. We're seeing the mechanics in view throughout. A really effective lighting element that they used right at the end of the show was when the convicts were all huddled downstage centre and they'd lowered a curtain of torn flags and Union Jacks as if they'd created a mock-up theatre curtain, and the convicts were peering through it. So the convicts were facing the audience, the curtain was behind them, and then the convicts would turn around, so they'd have their back to the audience, and they'd peer through the curtain as if they were looking toward the audience of amassed convicts and officers waiting for the play to start. So that was a nice use of a curtain to create the idea of a theatre space. But then, when the show started, the curtain was moved, and the convicts turned their backs to the audience, and they faced upstage centre. A lantern was lowered from the rig, so we saw the lantern, and it shone directly at the convicts. So it created a sort of silhouette effect of the convicts, and the bright light of the lantern slightly dazzled the audience, but also gave the impression of theatre lighting. It was as if the convicts were stepping out into this huge stage, this huge arena, and saying the lines of Farquhar and embracing this new identity, not as convicts, but as actors, as civilised members of society. Now, obviously, in the late 1700s, they would not have had lanterns and theatre lighting and the electricity. So this was, again, a deliberate anachronistic addition. We could see the lantern. It was bright, it was blinding, it was dazzling, it was theatrical, and it was there to create that final message about the enduring power and force and joy and intoxicating catharsis that can be felt through theatre and theatre production. I really enjoyed that final lighting effect. It was very dramatic and it was very moving and cathartic at the same time. Bravo! The sound design was a combination of diegetic and non-diegetic sounds. We had diegetic sounds such as insects chirping in the background, the soft sound of the sea, soft sounds of maybe wind, but they weren't really taken to any substantial degree, in my opinion. We had maybe some Aboriginal drumming at one point, but it wasn't, for me, I wanted it to be a bit more realised. I really wanted to hear the intensity of the insects. I really wanted to hear the sound of the sea and the elements to try and create the enormity of this vast wilderness that they found themselves in. But that's just my personal opinion. They did use diegetic sound, but I'd have liked a little bit more. They used non-diegetic sound as well. This was very much prevalent in the scene changes. A scene would end and we'd have maybe violins and drumming. On one hand, the drumming echoed sort of Aboriginal culture, but it had a sort of catchy beat to it, which almost took it into an 80s club scene at a couple of points. It sort of created that vibe, which again, I think was probably a combination of the elements, the historical context of the late 1700s, and also bringing the play into more of a contemporary mindset. I think that was possibly the idea behind it. If you're talking about sound design in Our Country's Good, they did use reverb. They used reverb a couple of times. The first time, which was very striking and had a very strong emotional impact, was when convicts were taken off stage to be whipped. You could hear their scream, and the scream had a reverb to it. It gave it a heightened, a deeper and more visceral quality. So it really helped the audience feel that tense and fearful mood and atmosphere, and also that empathy with the plight of the convicts and the theme of brutality. So that level of reverb worked quite well. They also used echo as well, certain times when there were screams and you could sort of hear it echoed back. So reverb and echoing was used very well in the sound design to enhance the theme of brutality. So I did think that was really rather effective. They did use reverb in another section of the play that I didn't really feel worked well. Now, quick sidebar, you don't have to love everything. If you go and see a show for school and you're evaluating it for live performance, if there's something you didn't like, that's absolutely fine. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. As long as you can justify it if you loved it, justify it if you hated it, justify it if you just weren't that sure. As long as you can say why you felt how you felt, you're not going to get penalised. You don't have to love everything. If we all loved the same things, life would be very boring. So, this was the scene where Harry died. Sorry, spoiler, Harry doesn't make it. I've never seen the show performed before without Harry present in this scene. He's always been there lying. I mean, he doesn't speak, he's dying. But I've never seen it done before without him in it. But in this production, we had Duckling sort of centre stage, and she was speaking off towards the stage left wings, which suggested that Harry was in a tent off stage. There were two officers stationed stage left with their backs to Duckling, which again suggested that they were guarding the entrance to Harry's tent and she wasn't allowed inside. So I did quite like that she wasn't given access to his final moments. I thought that was an interesting take. But it wasn't enough for me to gauge the emotion behind it, and I really wanted to feel it more, because Harry's journey and the way it was performed was really visceral and gut-wrenching and very, very intense. And then to not see the final part of his story, to not see him depart this mortal coil, for me, I felt a little bit cheated. But their use of sound didn't really work for me either. So if I was writing about this in an essay, I'm evaluating why it didn't really work for me. Duckling would say her lines. Now, Duckling's speech is made up of a series of promises. I promise to speak to you. I promise not to be silent. I promise to love you. I promise to be open to you. And after each promise, we would hear the sound effect of a moan. And there would be some reverb, a little bit of echo on it, as if Harry was trying to speak to her, but unable to because he's so unwell. But it just sounded like a sort of moaning sound. So she'd make a promise, there'd be a moan with a little bit of reverb and the touch of echo. She'd make another promise, ooh, another moan. She'd make another promise, ooh, another moan. And it got to the point where it was so repetitive that the audience, some members of the audience, started sniggering. And I just felt that having him on stage would have been a more satisfying emotional finale for him, rather than taking the gamble. And yes, it must have been devastating for Duckling to not be able to be with him in his final moments. So I do understand that showed the status between the convicts and the Marines. They were not going to let her in his tent. So it did communicate the theme of status, which is a huge theme in Our Country's Good. But I felt the realism of the moment was taken from us. So I personally would have preferred him to be on stage without the reverb, without the moaning. There was a plastic chair right between Duckling and the officers. There was a plastic decking chair on stage, so it looked like she was speaking through a plastic chair to Harry in his tent. And yes, I understand that the plastic chair showed that the Australian wilderness was getting littered by the colony, but for that scene, to me, it was just an unnecessary distraction. I don't think it was an effective epic theatre technique. I felt in this moment that pursuing the realistic departure for Harry would have been more effective. So that's an example of me describing a moment, evaluating what I felt about it, and justifying my feelings, which is perfectly valid for an essay. How about the costume? The costume combined two elements which I found very, very effective. On one hand, they were using period-specific features which matched the historical context of late 1700s, the first fleet that arrived in Botany Bay. So we had the tricorn hats, we had cravats, we had long military coats in red, in blue, with the golden embellishments and the braiding. We had breeches, we had long flowing skirts, we had waistcoats. So those costume items, and they were dirtied, and so they looked worn, they looked like they'd been dyed by the harsh Australian sun, they looked hot and uncomfortable, and they very much echoed the period features that you would find in a late 1700s costume for the convicts and the Marines. But they took that and then they combined it with deliberately anachronistic costume elements as well, which were very starkly contemporary. For example, a t-shirt with a Coca-Cola slogan across it and sort of tropical shorts. Liz Morden wore an Adidas tracksuit combination. Mary Brennan wore high-topped 80s sneakers. Ralph had a t-shirt on rather than a cravat. And it says in the programme for the production that they had a lot of fun combining these two different historical elements, the late 1700s combined with these contemporary elements. And again, it was deliberate. It was there on purpose. As I said before, this show is a combination of historical, but also it's encouraging the audience to think how they can relate it to contemporary ideas and thinking. We're looking at the convicts. By seeing them in a combination of historical and contemporary clothes, it brings us right into nowadays. You could start thinking about deportation, human trafficking. It brings it and makes it really, really current rather than sticking it in this one historical period. So I found that combination very, very effective. It was also a great making strange technique. You are putting something on the stage that you weren't expecting, that is unfamiliar. We're making the action strange and we're encouraging the audience to think. Big thumbs up for the costume design.